When I first moved into the old Victorian house, I didn't think much of the overgrown backyard. The real estate agent had mentioned it offhand, almost as a joke. A little DIY project for a green thumb, she'd said with a smile. I didn't have a green thumb, nor did I particularly care. The price of the house was right, and the location was perfect, so I figured I could live with a few weeds. It wasn't until about a month in that I decided to do something about it. My weekends were quiet, and I thought, why not? It'd be nice to clean it up a bit, maybe plant some flowers, make it a space where I could have friends over for barbecues in the summer. That's when I noticed the hole. It wasn't immediately obvious, hidden beneath layers of tangled weeds and vines, just behind an old, broken-down garden shed. But once I cleared the space, there it was, a circular pit, about 5 feet wide, its edges lined with crumbling stones. It looked old, much older than the house itself, and it went deep. Too deep to see the bottom, even in broad daylight. Curiosity got the better of me. I found a flashlight in the shed, leaned over the edge, and shone it down into the hole. Nothing. The light barely reached past the first few feet before being swallowed by darkness. I threw a small stone down, waiting to hear the sound of it hitting the bottom, but no sound came. I told myself it was probably filled with dirt or debris, nothing to worry about. Still, something about that hole stuck with me. It didn't feel right. There was no logical reason for it to be there. Who would dig something like that in their backyard? A couple of nights later, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged across the ground. It was coming from outside, from the backyard. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound continued, slow and deliberate. My mind immediately went to the hole. I grabbed my phone, using its weak light to navigate through the house, and made my way to the back door. The night was still, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. But that scraping sound, it was louder now, echoing from the direction of the hole. I stepped outside, moving slowly toward the pit. My heart was racing, and I could feel the cool grass beneath my bare feet, the dew soaking into my skin. The flashlight I'd left in the shed was long dead, so I used my phone, its dim light barely cutting through the darkness. When I reached the edge of the hole, the sound stopped. I stood there, breath held, staring down into the blackness. For a moment I thought maybe I had imagined it, that I'd been half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, a soft, low whisper, faint, barely audible, like someone was speaking from deep below the earth. I couldn't make out the words, but there was a rhythm to it, a pattern. My skin crawled. I backed away from the hole, stumbling over my own feet as I hurried back to the house. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning I called a contractor. I wanted the hole sealed up. I didn't care how much it would cost, I just wanted it gone. The contractor showed up the following day, a burly guy with a no-nonsense attitude. I led him to the backyard, explaining the situation as casually as I could, though I'm sure I sounded a little on edge. He nodded along, not really interested in my story. But when we reached the hole, his expression changed. He stared down into it for a long moment, frowning. "That's not right," he muttered almost to himself. "What's not?" I asked, trying to keep the anxiety out of my voice. He didn't answer at first. Instead, he picked up a loose stone from the edge of the pit and tossed it in. We both stood there, waiting for the sound of it hitting the bottom. Nothing. "No way," he said, shaking his head. "That's too deep." He turned to me, looking more serious than he had when he arrived. "I can seal it up, sure, but I'd get someone out here to look at this. A professional." I nodded, pretending to agree. But in my mind I was thinking, seal it. Seal it now. I didn't want to deal with this any longer than I had to. By the afternoon, the hole was filled. The contractor had covered it with dirt and rocks, packing it down as best he could. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as I stood there, looking at the freshly packed earth. It was done. The hole was gone. But that night, the scraping returned. I woke up in the dark, the same soft, rhythmic sound pulling me from sleep. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it was louder than before, closer. I jumped out of bed, rushing to the back window, my hands trembling as I pulled the curtains aside. In the faint moonlight, I could see the dirt around the hole had been disturbed, chunks of earth scattered across the grass. The hole was open again. I didn't want to go outside, didn't want to get near that thing. But something in me, some mix of fear and anger, pushed me forward. I grabbed my phone, flicking on the flashlight, and stepped out into the yard. As I approached the hole, my blood ran cold. The dirt that had been packed down earlier was now piled in neat little mounds around the pit. And in the center of the hole was something new, a ladder, a rickety old wooden ladder, descending deep into the darkness. My phone's light barely reached the first few rungs before being swallowed by the void below. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. There hadn't been a ladder before. Someone, or something, had put it there. and then I heard it again, the whispering. This time it was clearer. It was coming from deep within the hole, but I could make out the words now, faint and distorted. "Come down." My legs moved before my brain caught up, backing away from the hole. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, echoing up from the depths below. "Come down." I turned and ran, slamming the back door behind me, locking it tight. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I backed away from the door, listening for any sign that something was following. But there was only silence. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I sat in the living room, staring at the back door, waiting for something to happen. By morning, the ladder was gone. The dirt was undisturbed, the hole sealed once more. I've worked as a night receptionist at a small-town motel for nearly 5 years. It's mostly a quiet gig, a perfect blend of boring and predictable. Most nights, the only guests we get are traveling salespeople or truckers passing through. But every once in a while, we get someone different. It was a Wednesday night, raining hard, which usually meant no late check-ins. People would rather sleep in their cars than brave the storm. The motel lobby was quiet, except for the soft hum of the vending machine and the faint sound of rain hitting the window. I was halfway through a podcast, trying to stay awake, when the bell above the entrance jingled. I looked up from the desk. A man stood at the door, dripping wet, his coat plastered to his body from the downpour outside. He didn't have an umbrella. I noticed he wasn't carrying any luggage either. He was thin, with messy dark hair that clung to his forehead. He wasn't old, but there was something about him that felt off. Maybe it was the way he stood, a little too still, or how his eyes seemed to linger on the walls before he finally looked at me. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing a polite smile. The man stepped forward, water pooling at his feet. He took a long, slow breath before speaking, like he hadn't used his voice in a while. "Room for the night." There was something strange about the way he said it, like he wasn't really asking, but stating a fact, as if it was a given that I'd let him stay. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "Sure," I said, pulling up the reservation system. "ID and payment?" He stared at me for a moment, his eyes dark and hollow before reaching into his coat. His hand moved slowly, methodically, like he was carefully choosing each motion. He pulled out a driver's license and a soggy $20 bill. The ID was soaked, the edges curling, but I could still make out the name, Thomas Gale. "All right, Mr. Gale," I said, doing my best to keep the small talk going, hoping it would smooth over the weirdness in the air. "One night?" He nodded, not saying a word. "Room 9, I said, sliding the key across the counter. "It's just down the hall." He didn't thank me, didn't acknowledge me at all. He just took the key and turned, dripping water onto the lobby floor as he walked toward the hallway. I watched him go, the back of his coat tattered and worn, frayed at the bottom. When the door to room 9 closed with a soft click, the lobby felt a little colder. I sat back down, feeling uneasy for reasons I couldn't explain. I told myself it was nothing. I'd seen plenty of strange people pass through this place. It was part of the job, but something about this man stuck with me. The stillness in his movements, the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. I couldn't shake it. By 2 a.m., the rain had eased up, and the wind outside rattled the windows occasionally. I was just starting to feel the weight of my eyelids when the phone rang. It was the front desk line, but no one was there. Static buzzed on the other end, broken by soft, shallow breathing. I frowned, wondering if it was a prank. "Hello?" I asked, my voice cutting through the static. Nothing, just breathing. The call ended abruptly with a soft click. I checked the caller ID, room 9. My stomach dropped. Maybe he was having trouble with the room, I reasoned. The phone could have malfunctioned, or maybe he just dialed the front desk by accident. But the breath, that didn't feel like an accident. I stared at the clock, weighing my options. The motel didn't have security. If anything weird was happening, it was just me out here to deal with it. After a minute of debating with myself, I decided to check on the guy. I grabbed the master key and walked down the hall. The corridor was darker than usual, or at least it felt that way. I stopped outside room 9 and knocked softly. "Mr. Gale? Everything okay in there?" No response. I knocked again, a little louder this time. "Mr. Gale?" Still nothing. I stood there for a moment, listening for any sound, footsteps, movement, breathing, anything, but the room was completely silent. I glanced down at the master key in my hand, debating whether to use it. Finally, my curiosity won over my better judgment. I slid the key into the lock and turned the handle. The door creaked open, and I immediately noticed the smell. It was faint but unmistakable, a mixture of damp earth and something metallic, like rust or old blood. My hand hesitated on the doorknob, but I pushed the door open anyway. The room was empty. The bed was made, perfectly untouched, the bathroom door slightly ajar. The window was open, rain blowing in from outside. I took a step into the room, calling out again, "Mr. Gale?" Nothing. I approached the bathroom, pushing the door open with the back of my hand. The light was off, but from what I could see, it was just as empty as the rest of the room. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was wrong. Very wrong. I stepped back into the main room, my eyes scanning every corner. That's when I noticed the wet footprints. They started at the window and led toward the door, stopping just before the hallway. I hadn't seen them when I first came in. They weren't made by shoes either. Bare feet, long and thin, like the prints of someone who'd been out in the cold too long. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain the footprints, the smell, or why this room was empty when a man had checked in just hours ago. But one thing was clear. Whoever had been in here wasn't Mr. Gale. I backed out of the room slowly, pulling the door shut behind me. I hurried back to the front desk, grabbing my phone to call the police. But as I picked it up, the phone rang again. Room 9. I stared at the screen, feeling the blood drain from my face. With shaking hands, I answered. The same soft, shallow breathing crackled through the receiver. This time, though, it wasn't alone. I could hear something else. A whisper, faint and broken, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of water. I never left. The phone slipped from my hand, hitting the floor with a hollow thud. My heart raced as I stared at the screen, the line still open, the whisper growing fainter and fainter until it was gone. I locked up the front desk, left a note for the morning shift, and got out of there as fast as I could. I quit. I usually took the main road into town, but that morning, I decided to cut through the woods. I'm not sure why. Maybe I thought it'd be quicker, or maybe something about the mist hanging over the trees felt like an invitation. I'd used the shortcut a dozen times before. It was a narrow path that snaked through the woods and connected my neighborhood to the road by the school. The whole walk took maybe 20 minutes. But that day, something was different. The air was thick with fog, the kind that clings close to the ground and makes everything feel eerie, like you've walked into a different world. I could barely see the trees at the edges of the path, their twisted branches stretching overhead and forming a kind of tunnel. Everything was quiet, too. No birds, no wind, just the muffled crunch of leaves under my feet. I checked my watch. I'd left the house early, thinking I'd have time to stop for coffee before class. But as I walked, the path seemed to stretch on longer than usual. Every step felt like it was taking me deeper, pulling me into some hidden corner of the woods. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. But the further I walked, the more the silence pressed in on me, thick and heavy. About halfway through, I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a hint of something sour and metallic. I ignored it, thinking it was just the damp earth or maybe a dead animal nearby. But the smell grew stronger, filling the air around me, a stench so thick I could almost taste it, rotting meat mixed with something metallic like blood. I stopped, covering my mouth and nose, and looked around. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around me, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shape in the mist, just off the path. It was faint, like a shadow, barely visible through the haze. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, and then I saw him. A man standing among the trees just beyond the edge of the path. He was tall, too tall, his limbs thin and unnaturally long, his body twisted and contorted like he was struggling to hold himself upright. But what made my stomach turn, what made my blood run cold, was his skin. Or rather, the lack of it. He had no skin, just muscle and sinew stretched taut over bone, glistening wet under the faint light filtering through the trees. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, each one causing his exposed muscles to twitch and shift. His head was tilted slightly to the side, his empty eyes fixed on me, dark and hollow, like two pits that went on forever. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, his teeth sharp and too white, gleaming in the dim light. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My feet felt rooted to the ground, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was trapped in his gaze, held captive by those dark, empty eyes. His voice a wet, gurgling whisper, like he was forcing the words through a mouthful of blood. The sound was wrong, each word drawn out, slow, deliberate, like he was tasting them, savoring them. I swallowed, my throat dry, and managed to shake my head though my entire body was trembling. No, I'm just going to school. The man's grin widened, stretching across his raw, exposed face in a way that looked painful, like his muscles were pulling too tight. His head tilted further, his empty eyes studying me with a strange, unsettling intensity. School, he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. You shouldn't be here. My heart pounded harder, every instinct screaming at me to turn and run. But I couldn't move, couldn't look away. He took a slow step forward, his bare, bloody feet squelching against the ground, leaving dark, wet footprints on the leaves. I could hear the sound of his muscles shifting, sticky and wet, like meat being pulled apart. "Where is your skin?" he asked, his voice softer now, almost curious. His gaze roamed over me, his expression a mix of hunger and something darker, something I couldn't understand. I have to go," I stammered, finally finding the strength to move. I took a shaky step back, my heart racing, but he took another step forward, mirroring me, his grin widening. "No," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Stay with me." My legs finally obeyed and I turned, breaking into a sprint down the path, my feet pounding the ground as I ran. The trees blurred around me, the fog thickening, closing in, but I didn't dare look back. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps slow and deliberate, each one sending a jolt of terror through me. "Where are you going?" he called out, his voice echoing through the trees, filled with a sick, twisted amusement. I ran faster, my lungs burning, my mind racing. The path seemed endless, stretching on and on, the trees pressing in, twisting and darkening, like they were trying to trap me, to hold me there. My breaths came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. But then suddenly, the footsteps stopped. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving as I looked around. The path was empty. There was no sign of him, no sound, nothing but the silent trees and the thick fog hanging low over the ground. I took a shaky breath, relief flooding over me, but it was quickly replaced by dread as I noticed something pinned to a tree just a few feet away. A piece of paper, tacked to the bark, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I stepped closer, my hands trembling as I reached out and grabbed it. The words were scrawled in dark, jagged handwriting. "You can't leave. You belong with me." My blood turned to ice. I crumpled the paper, my mind screaming to get out, to run. I turned and sprinted down the path, my footsteps echoing in the eerie silence. But as I ran, I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps coming from somewhere just behind me, each one matching my pace, like he was following, waiting. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I kept running, my heart pounding, my breaths ragged, the footsteps growing louder, closer, until I could feel his presence, a dark, twisted shadow at my back. And then, just as I thought I'd never escape, I saw the trees thin ahead, the faint light of the main road filtering through. I stumbled out of the woods, collapsing onto the gravel, my hands scraped and bleeding, my heart racing. I lay there for a moment, gasping for air, too terrified to move. When I finally dared to look back, the path was empty, the trees still and silent. But I could feel him, watching me from the shadows, his dark, empty eyes fixed on me, his twisted grin lingering in my mind. I never took the shortcut through the woods again. The stories about Black Oak Woods were the kind of tales that everyone in our small town had heard, but no one truly believed. They said that if you were unlucky enough to wander too deep into the woods on a misty night, you might see her, the headless bride. She'd appear, dressed in an old wedding gown, standing silently among the trees. People claimed she was looking for her head or her lost groom, but most shrugged it off as just another local ghost story. I'd never given the legend much thought, but one cold autumn night, my friend Derek dared me to go with him into Black Oak Woods to disprove the story once and for all. Derek loved a good scare and knew how to twist any situation into something creepier than it was. So when he showed up at my place with flashlights and that mischievous grin, I rolled my eyes but agreed. I didn't believe in ghosts, but I was curious. We headed out around midnight, the mist rolling in thick, clinging low to the ground and swirling around our feet as we walked. The trees loomed high overhead, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Our only light was the flashlights, cutting narrow beams through the fog, casting eerie shadows on the ground. The deeper we went, the quieter it got, as if the whole forest were holding its breath. "Think we'll find her?" Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I scoffed, though my voice wavered a bit. "There's no headless bride, Derek. Just a story to keep kids from wandering out here alone." He grinned, nudging me with his elbow. "Then you won't mind going a little farther?" We walked for what felt like an eternity, the fog thickening, swallowing up the trail behind us. The air grew colder, sharper, and an uneasy feeling settled over me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I kept looking back, feeling like someone or something was watching us from the shadows. But every time I turned, there was nothing, just trees and mist. Suddenly, Derek stopped, his flashlight fixed on something up ahead. "Do you see that?" I followed his gaze, squinting into the darkness. At first, I thought it was just more mist, a trick of the light. But then I saw it, a shape, faint and ghostly, standing between the trees. It looked like a woman, her figure pale and shrouded in fog. She was dressed in a long, flowing gown, the white fabric torn and stained, hanging limply over her thin frame. My heart pounded as I took a step back. "Derek, we should go." But Derek was already moving forward, his flashlight pointed straight at her. "Are you kidding? This is the best part," he whispered excitedly. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge us. She just stood there, as though she were rooted to the spot. And as we got closer, I realized why I couldn't see her face. She didn't have one. Her head was missing, her neck ending in a raw, jagged line, with bits of dark, decaying flesh where her head should have been. The gown hung loosely on her skeletal shoulders, dirt-streaked and frayed, the fabric pooling around her feet like a ghostly fog. I felt bile rise in my throat, a cold sweat breaking over me as my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Derek, oblivious or maybe just in denial, took a few more steps forward, grinning like he'd just discovered buried treasure. "It's just a prank," he whispered, mostly to himself. "It has to be." But then she moved. The headless bride took a slow, deliberate step forward, her arms hanging limply at her sides. I could feel the chill coming off her, a biting cold that seemed to reach right into my bones. Her gown rustled as she moved, dragging through the leaves, each step sending shivers down my spine. "Derek, stop!" I managed to choke out, grabbing his arm. But he shook me off, still grinning, convinced it was all a joke. "Hey!" he called, waving his flashlight at her. "Nice costume. You almost had me for a second." The bride stopped, tilting her headless neck as though listening. Her body shuddered, and then with a low, haunting moan that echoed through the trees, she lifted her arm, pointing straight at Derek. We both froze, the air thick with dread. Her arm hung there, trembling, her bony finger aimed directly at him. I could feel the weight of her gaze, though she had no eyes, no face, just an overwhelming sense that she was watching, waiting. Derek's grin faded, replaced by a look of confusion, and then fear. He took a step back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Hey, let's go," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. But the bride didn't let him go. She took another step forward, her feet gliding soundlessly over the ground, closing the distance between them. Her fingers stretched out, bony and pale, reaching for him, like she was trying to grab hold. Derek stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling onto the ground. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing his arm, pulling him away as she advanced. We sprinted through the forest, branches snagging at our clothes, the mist swirling around us, thick and heavy. The sound of her dragging footsteps followed us, echoing in the darkness, that low, haunting moan growing louder, closer, as though she were right behind us. We finally broke through the tree line, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. I glanced back, expecting to see her, but there was nothing there. Just the mist, rolling thick and silent among the trees. We didn't stop running until we reached my house, slamming the door behind us, locking it tight. Derek was pale, shaking, his eyes wide with terror. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the silence thick with what we'd seen, what we'd almost touched. Later that night, when I finally drifted off to sleep, I dreamed of her. I saw her standing in the mist, her headless figure gliding through the trees, her arms outstretched as though reaching for something she'd never find. And when I woke, drenched in sweat, I could still feel the chill of her presence, the icy grip of her hand closing around me, her endless search haunting me long after I'd left the forest. They say she's still out there, the headless bride of Black Oak Woods, searching for her missing head, or maybe for a groom who left her waiting at the altar. And sometimes, on misty nights, I hear her, that low, mournful moan drifting through the trees, reminding me that she's still looking, and that someday she might just find me.
It was my second year at Blackwood High, and most mornings I took the shortcut through the woods behind the school. It was faster, quieter, and a nice way to start the day alone before the halls filled up. It wasn't a place anyone else went, so I was surprised one cold October morning when I saw her there. A girl, sitting on an old tree stump, her long black hair cascading over her shoulders. She was wearing a school uniform that looked like ours, but something about it seemed slightly different, outdated maybe. She noticed me staring and smiled. "Hey," she said, standing up and brushing off her skirt. "You go to Blackwood, right?" I nodded, a bit surprised. "Yeah, but I don't think I've seen you around." She shrugged, looking away. "I just started, and I don't come every day. My family keeps me busy at home." She paused, a small, almost wistful smile crossing her face. "Guess I'm easy to miss." There was something mysterious about her, but she was friendly, easy to talk to. She introduced herself as Leah, and we chatted about school, teachers, and books. She knew all the typical jokes and gossip and had a calm, soothing voice that drew me in. When the school bell rang, I reluctantly said goodbye and continued my walk, promising I'd see her again. Over the next few weeks, Leah became a part of my routine. I found myself looking forward to those mornings in the woods, talking about everything, our families, the classes we liked, and the books we were reading. She was quirky, funny, and had a way of making everything feel just a little more magical. There were odd things about her, sure. She never mentioned a phone or social media. She avoided talking about classmates, and she never wanted to meet on the actual school grounds. But she seemed so real, so natural, that I didn't question it. One day, we started talking about school events. I asked if she'd be going to the fall festival that weekend, hoping we could finally hang out outside in the woods. "I don't think so," she replied, looking away. Her voice was soft, almost sad. "I don't go to things like that." My family, well, they're pretty strict about what I do and where I go. Before I could ask her anything more, she glanced at her watch and stood up. I should go, she said quickly. I'll see you soon. She walked away, disappearing into the mist, and I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling her words had left me with. Something about her was strange, maybe even a little too mysterious, but I told myself it didn't matter. She was a friend, and I'd leave it at that. A few days later, my friend Henry and I were walking down the hallway after school when he nudged me and pointed toward the principal's office. Let's go snoop around. He knew I couldn't resist a little mischief. We waited until the hallway emptied, then tiptoed toward the office, glancing over our shoulders as we went. Once inside, we rummaged through some files, just for fun. Then, something caught my eye. An old stack of school yearbooks sitting on a shelf, covered in a thin layer of dust. Curious, I pulled one from the middle, dated 1988, and started flipping through it, laughing at the outdated hairstyles and clothes. But then I froze. There, on the second page, was a photo of Leah. I stared, my heart pounding, as I read the caption under her name. Leah Moore, grade 10. The date hit me like a punch to the gut. This was over 30 years ago. I skimmed through the yearbook, finding her picture in club photos, in group shots, her face in everyone. And in every picture, she looked exactly the same. Same long black hair, same dark eyes, same soft, distant smile. My stomach churned. I had just spoken to her that morning. I was sure of it. She told me about her family, her plans to read a book over the weekend. How could she have been a student over 30 years ago? Hey, Henry said, looking over my shoulder. Why are you just staring at that page? I couldn't speak. I just pointed to her photo. Henry squinted, then looked at me with a confused expression. Wait, is that her? That girl you're always talking about? I nodded, swallowing hard. This doesn't make sense, I whispered. I mean, she's real. I've seen her every day for weeks. We talk. I know her. Henry laughed nervously. Well, maybe she just looks like someone from back then. You know, people say everyone has a look-alike, right? I wanted to believe him, but something in my gut told me it was more than that. My mind flashed to those little things Leah had said, her vague mentions of her family, her reluctance to talk about anyone else in school, how she always avoided campus. Later that night, I couldn't get Leah's photo out of my head. I stayed up, combing through old online articles, desperately searching for anything about her. And then, finally, I found it. A small, faded headline from 1989. Blackwood High student found dead in woods. I clicked on the article, my hands shaking as I read. Leah Moore, a 10th grader, had been found dead in the woods behind Blackwood High. The article didn't provide many details, only that her body had been discovered weeks after she'd gone missing, and the cause of death was undetermined. The town had mourned her loss, but the case had been closed without answers. A chill ran down my spine as I thought of our conversations. Her quiet laugh, her soft voice. I had spent the past few weeks talking to someone who had been dead for over 3 decades. The next morning, despite every instinct telling me to stay away, I went to the woods. I needed to see her, to hear her explain what I'd found. When I reached our usual meeting spot, Leah was already there, sitting on the tree stump, her hands folded in her lap. Hey, she said softly, her dark eyes meeting mine. There was something sad in her gaze, something I hadn't noticed before. I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. Leah, I found an old yearbook. From 1988, you were in it, and I found an article about you. They said you died in these woods. Her face didn't change, but she looked away, her eyes distant. I was wondering when you'd find out, she murmured. My heart pounded. But you're here. We've been talking every day. You're real. She nodded slowly, a faint, sad smile crossing her face. I am. At least, I feel real. I can talk and think and remember, but I can't leave these woods. I took a step back, the reality of it all crashing over me. Why? Why are you here, Leah? She looked at me, her eyes pleading. I don't know. I just woke up here one morning, and I haven't been able to leave since. The woods hold me here. They don't let me go. I felt a surge of sympathy, mixed with a bone-deep fear. So all this time, all those stories you told me, they were real. They were from my life, she said softly. But I don't know why I'm still here, or why you're the only one who's ever seen me. We stood in silence, the weight of her words settling between us. I wanted to help her, to do something, anything, to ease her suffering. But what could I do? She was trapped here, a ghost bound to the woods, to the life she'd left behind. Suddenly, she took a step back, her face contorting with fear. You need to go, now. What? Why? I stammered, confused. They don't like it when someone finds out. They don't want anyone to know. Her voice was filled with panic, her eyes wide with terror. Please, go. Before it's too late. I felt a cold, creeping dread as the trees around us seemed to close in, the shadows growing darker, deeper. I turned and ran, sprinting down the path, not daring to look back. I could feel something following me, a presence lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, like the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting. When I finally broke free of the trees, I collapsed onto the road, gasping for air, my heart racing. I looked back, expecting to see Leah, but the path was empty, the woods silent. I never saw her again. I avoided the woods, taking the long way to school every day, but I could still feel her presence, like a shadow lingering just beyond the trees. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice, soft and pleading, echoing through the darkness. Please, don't forget me.
It was already Halloween night, and I wasn't exactly in the mood for handing out candy. My shift at the coffee shop had been brutal, non-stop pumpkin spice madness, and by the time I got home, I just wanted to crash on the couch and watch some trashy horror movies. I'd left a bowl of candy on the porch with a "Take One" sign, but we all know how that goes. By the time the second group of kids rolled through, that bowl would be empty. As the evening dragged on, I half expected the usual swarm of trick-or-treaters. But the street outside my house was unusually quiet. I figured most of the kids had already hit up the better neighborhoods with bigger candy bars. Mine wasn't exactly prime real estate. The houses were old, a little run down, and it wasn't uncommon for one or two to stay dark every Halloween. Still, it felt off, too quiet for the night of the year, where chaos was supposed to reign. Around 9 p.m., just as I was about to call it a night, I heard a knock on the door. Not the excited pounding of sugar-crazed kids, though. This was slow, deliberate, like whoever was on the other side wasn't in a rush. I muted the TV, sitting up. No one had knocked all night, and I hadn't seen anyone come up the driveway. I waited a moment, wondering if it was a fluke or a prank. Then the knock came again. 3 slow, heavy thuds, each one sending a chill down my spine. I got up and went to the door, more annoyed than anything. If some teenager thought they were going to get a scare out of me, they were in for a disappointment. I swung the door open, expecting to see a couple of older kids in lazy costumes. Instead, there was a man, alone. He wasn't in costume either. He was just standing there, wearing an old, worn-out jacket, his face partially obscured by the shadow of the porch light. He didn't look homeless or dirty, just ordinary. But something about him was off. Maybe it was the way he stood so still, or the way his eyes were fixed on mine without blinking. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my hand on the door. The man didn't answer right away. He just kept staring like he hadn't quite heard me. His silence stretched out until it was uncomfortable. Finally he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm looking for the last house." I blinked. The last house?" He nodded, ever so slightly. "The last house on the street." "This is the last house," I said, frowning. "You've reached—" The man didn't react. He just kept staring. The silence between us felt oppressive, like the air had thickened. My pulse quickened, but I kept my face neutral. "Listen," I said. "It's late, man. If you're trick-or-treating or whatever, we're done for the night." He didn't move, not even a flinch. "I need to come inside," he said, his voice steady, almost robotic. That's when I noticed it. His shoes, they were caked with mud, thick, wet mud, the kind you'd see in a swamp or a bog, but it hadn't rained here for weeks. Not since early October. "I'm not letting you in," I said, stepping back and gripping the edge of the door. The uneasy feeling that had been simmering in my gut suddenly boiled over into full-blown fear. The man took a step forward, and I instinctively slammed the door shut, throwing the lock. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door. He hadn't tried to push it open, but I wasn't taking any chances. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table, my hands shaking, and dialed my friend Emily. She lived down the street, and I figured if anyone could tell me what was up, she could. "Hey Em, something weird just happened," I said as soon as she picked up. "Some guy just showed up at my door. Creepy as hell. He asked to come in." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Did he say anything about the last house?" she asked, her voice suddenly serious. My blood ran cold. "Yeah, how did you know? Get out of the house, right now," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Just leave." "What? Why?" "Just go. I'll explain later." I hesitated, the phone shaking in my hand. "Em, you're scaring me. What's going on? Please, just listen to me. Get out. Don't open the door for anyone. Know what? I'll meet you at the gas station down the street." I hung up, my heart racing. Grabbing my keys and coat, I headed for the back door. I wasn't sure if I was being paranoid, but Emily's fear had rattled me. I pulled open the door, only to stop dead in my tracks. The man was standing in my backyard. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. He was just standing there as still as before, watching me through the darkness. My back hit the kitchen counter, and I frantically scanned the room for anything I could use to defend myself. A knife, a chair, anything. But the man didn't move. He just tilted his head slightly as if considering me. Then in that same low, eerie voice, he spoke again. "You were always the last house." A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the truth. He wasn't just talking about tonight. Somehow, he knew. He knew I had been the last person on this street to buy a house, to move in. He knew too much. "I'm not coming inside," he said softly. "You already let me in." I turned, bolting for the front door. My mind raced, heart pounding as I fumbled with the lock. I could feel his presence behind me, closer now. I could almost hear his slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor. I threw open the door and ran, sprinting into the night, not stopping until I reached the gas station where Emily was waiting. She grabbed my arm the moment I arrived, her face pale. "He's gone, right?" I nodded, breathless. What was that?" She looked at me with wide eyes. "He comes every Halloween. People see him, but no one knows who he is. All I know is, if you're the last house, you're his." "His what?" She didn't answer, just looked back toward the dark street, as if she knew he was still out there waiting for his next visit. I grew up in a rural part of the Midwest, surrounded by miles of dense forest. My family owned a small cabin out by the lake, a quiet, secluded spot we used for fishing trips and summer vacations. When my parents passed away a few years back, they left the cabin to me. It was the one place that felt like home, even though I didn't visit often. About a month ago, I decided to take a break from the city and head out to the cabin for the weekend. I packed a few things, grabbed some groceries, and made the 2-hour drive out into the wilderness. The last stretch of the road was barely a road at all, just a dirt path cutting through thick trees, winding its way deeper into isolation. The moment I arrived, I felt that familiar calm wash over me. The air was fresh, the lake was still, and the only sound was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. I spent the day hiking, fishing, and unwinding, exactly what I needed. By the time night fell, I was feeling more relaxed than I had in months. I built a small fire outside the cabin and watched the stars slowly blink into view. There was no cell service out here, no Wi-Fi, just the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was around 10 p.m. when I first heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, distorted sound carried through the trees. But as I sat there listening, I realized it wasn't the wind at all. It was static, like the sound you hear on an old TV when it loses signal. A low, crackling noise, distant but persistent. I glanced around the clearing, but I couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of the fire. The woods stretched out into darkness, thick and impenetrable. I stood up, listening more intently. The static grew louder. It was coming from the woods, somewhere far off but getting closer. I felt a chill run down my spine, my heart picking up speed. I didn't have any electronic devices out here that could make that kind of noise. No radio, no TV, nothing. I tossed another log onto the fire, the sudden burst of light giving me a sense of comfort, however brief. I stared into the dark, trying to make sense of the noise. Then it stopped. The woods went silent again, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a few more minutes, listening, waiting, but the static didn't return. Eventually, I shook it off as my mind playing tricks on me. I'd been out here alone all day, and isolation can mess with your head. I sat back down by the fire, telling myself to relax, but I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I decided to call it a night. Inside the cabin, everything was just as I remembered. Old wooden furniture, creaky floorboards, and the faint smell of pine. I locked the door, grabbed a book, and settled into bed, trying to forget about the strange sound in the woods. But as the night wore on, sleep wouldn't come. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the static over and over. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it was closer. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The static was back, louder now, more distinct. It wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from inside the cabin. I could hear it faintly through the thin walls, as if it was coming from the living room. I crept out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. The static buzzed louder the closer I got to the living room. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the doorway. There, in the center of the room, was the old TV. It hadn't worked in years. It was one of those ancient boxy sets my parents had used when I was a kid. I'd never bothered to replace it after it broke, leaving it as nothing more than an ornament collecting dust. But now, the screen was flickering, static crawling across it in jagged, erratic waves. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the screen in disbelief. The TV had no power source. It wasn't plugged in. It couldn't be on. I stepped closer, the static growing louder with every step. My fingers twitched, itching to turn the thing off, but I didn't dare move. Something about the way the static moved across the screen felt wrong. It wasn't like normal TV static. It was too alive, too purposeful. Then, through the haze of static, an image began to form. At first, it was just a shadow, a figure. I squinted at the screen, my mind trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure grew clearer, like it was walking toward the camera, closer and closer. It was a man. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the flickering static. He wore dark, tattered clothes, and his movements were slow, deliberate. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound. He just stared. The man stopped moving. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching me through the screen. I stepped back, heart racing. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to move. The static grew louder, more aggressive, as the man on the screen raised his arm, pointing directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. He was looking at me, not through the screen, but at me, like he could see me standing there. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free from whatever grip had held me in place. I ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. The static buzzed in my ears, growing louder, impossibly loud. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it seeped through the walls, the floor, the very air around me. I don't know how long I sat there, curled up in a ball on the bed, shaking and trying to make sense of what I had just seen. At some point, the static stopped. Silence. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I crept out of the bedroom, half expecting to see the man standing in the living room, waiting for me. But when I peeked around the corner, the TV was off. Everything was back to normal. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and half-consciousness. I stayed awake until dawn, watching the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. No static, no figures, no whispers in the dark. I packed my things as soon as the sun came up and left the cabin. I haven't been back since. I don't know why we ignored the warnings. Maybe it was arrogance. We thought we knew better, that we were experienced enough hikers to handle a little backcountry trail. The ranger at the station had given us a long look when we asked about the Ridge Trail, told us it was closed off for the season. Landslides last year, he'd said, eyeing us like we were idiots. The whole area's unstable. You don't want to go up there. But we did. It wasn't even on the official map anymore. You had to follow the old markers, the faded signs half hidden by overgrowth. The trail had been popular once before the slides, before it was declared unsafe. I guess that's what made it appealing. We wanted something less crowded, something off the beaten path, something different. There were 4 of us, me, Dan, Carrie, and Sam. We'd done weekend hikes before, but nothing like this. The Ridge Trail was supposed to be breathtaking, with sheer drop-offs on either side and views that stretched for miles. It was dangerous, but that's what made it exciting. We started early, setting out while the morning mist still clung to the trees. The first few miles were easy, just like any other hike. The forest was dense, the air cool and damp. We were joking around, snapping photos, feeling like we were invincible. But as we got deeper into the woods, the trail started to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisting together overhead, blocking out the sunlight. The ground was soft, damp, and the path began to disappear beneath layers of fallen leaves and moss. The air felt heavier too, like it was pressing in on us. "Shouldn't we turn back?" Carrie asked after about an hour, her voice uneasy. She was the most cautious of the group, always the one to remind us to stick to the plan. "We're fine," Dan said, brushing off her concern. "We've gone too far to quit now. The ridge is just ahead." But it wasn't. The trail markers became harder to spot, some of them missing entirely, swallowed by the forest. We found ourselves doubling back more than once, checking the map, arguing about which way to go. The deeper we went, the more disoriented we became. The forest felt wrong, too quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our footsteps crunching over dead twigs and the occasional drip of water from the trees above. "We're lost," Sam said after another hour of wandering. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced with something close to panic. Dan shook his head. "We're not lost. We're just off track. We'll find it." But the truth was, none of us knew where we were. We were miles from the main trail, the terrain getting steeper and more treacherous with every step. The mist that had been hanging in the trees thickened, swirling around us like smoke. Everything looked the same. Every tree, every rock, every turn, like the forest was repeating itself, trapping us in some kind of loop. "Let's just head back the way we came," Carrie said, her voice tense. "Forget the ridge. This isn't worth it." But as we turned to go back, something shifted. The forest changed again, subtly at first, but enough to make my stomach churn. The trees looked different, taller, closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The path behind us was gone, swallowed by the underbrush. We couldn't retrace our steps even if we wanted to. That's when we saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were ours, deep impressions in the soft earth, heading off in the direction we'd come from. But then I realized something was off. The prints were too big, much bigger than any of our boots. and there was something wrong with the shape of them, the way the toes were splayed, the deep grooves where claws would have been. "What the hell is that?" Sam whispered, crouching down to get a closer look. None of us answered. We just stared at the tracks, our minds struggling to process what we were seeing. They weren't animal prints. They weren't human either. They were something else, something big. "We need to get out of here," Carrie said, her voice barely above a whisper. We started moving faster, abandoning the idea of finding the ridge. Now, it was just about getting back. The air felt colder, the mist thicker, clinging to our skin like damp cloth. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no birds, no sounds of wildlife. Just the crunch of our footsteps and the distant thumping of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then we heard it. A sound. Low, guttural, like something breathing. It was close, too close. I froze, holding up a hand to stop the others. The sound was coming from somewhere in the mist, just ahead of us, hidden in the swirling fog. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice shaking. We stood there, listening. The breathing grew louder, more ragged, like it was struggling for air. Then there was a soft thud, like something heavy stepping forward. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see through the mist, but there was nothing, just gray, endless gray. "Go," Dan hissed, grabbing my arm. "Go now." We ran. The forest blurred around us as we stumbled through the underbrush, branches scratching at our faces and arms. The mist was so thick I could barely see the others in front of me, just vague shapes moving through the fog. The ground was slick with mud, and more than once I nearly slipped, my legs screaming with the effort of running uphill. The breathing was behind us, closer now, faster, matching our pace. Whatever it was following us. I glanced back just for a second, and I saw something. A shape, hulking and massive, moving through the trees. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize, but it was fast, too fast. "Don't stop," Carrie screamed, her voice breaking. But Dan did stop. He stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he went down hard, tumbling into the mud. Sam and I skidded to a halt, rushing back to help him up, but it was too late. The thing was on him. I only caught a glimpse, just a flash of black, leathery skin, long arms that seemed to stretch unnaturally, fingers that ended in sharp, glistening claws. Dan screamed, a sound so raw and primal that it cut through the mist like a knife, and then he was gone. Dragged into the fog, his scream cutting off so suddenly it was like someone had flipped a switch. We stood there, frozen in shock, the silence pressing down on us like a weight. "We have to keep moving," Sam gasped, yanking me forward. I don't know how long we ran after that. Time seemed to blur, the mist swallowing us up. The forest felt endless, the trees closing in around us, twisting into shapes that shouldn't have existed. I could still hear the breathing behind us, that low, rattling sound, never too far away. Finally, the mist began to thin. The trees grew sparser, the air warmer. We burst through the tree line, stumbling onto an old fire road. We didn't stop running until we saw the ranger's station in the distance, a speck of civilization that seemed impossible after what we'd been through. We made it back, but Dan didn't. We told the ranger everything, about the trail, the footprints, the thing in the fog. He listened, his face pale, but I could tell he didn't believe us. Not really. When the search party went out the next day, they found nothing. No tracks, no signs of a struggle. Just an empty forest and a missing hiker. The official report said Dan probably slipped and fell, that he got lost in the fog and couldn't find his way back. But we know the truth. There's something out there in those woods, something that's not human. And if you ever hear its breathing behind you, run, but don't look back. Crow's Nest Ridge wasn't exactly a popular trail. It was one of those spots that didn't show up in most guides, but people talked about it in the kind of hush that made it sound like a local secret. My friend Jenna and I had heard rumors about how the trail was remote, untouched, the kind of place where you wouldn't run into anyone for miles. That's exactly what drew us to it. We liked isolation, the feeling of being truly out there, far from the noise of daily life. We set out on a crisp autumn morning. The air was heavy with that damp, earthy smell that comes before rain, but the sky was mostly clear. The trailhead was tucked away off a service road, barely marked. A rusted wooden sign with the name Crow's Nest Ridge hung loosely from a crooked post. It looked abandoned, like no one had cared for it in years. That should have been the first red flag. "Perfect," Jenna had said with a grin, adjusting her pack. "We'll have the whole place to ourselves." The trail started innocuously enough, weaving through dense, towering pines that blocked most of the sunlight. We were about an hour in when things started to feel different. At first it was subtle. The trees grew thicker, the air heavier. The temperature seemed to drop, not enough to be alarming, but enough to notice. The birds had gone quiet, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on the damp ground. "You notice how quiet it is?" Jenna asked, her voice low, like she didn't want to disturb the silence. "Yeah," I replied, glancing around. "It's a little weird," but we pressed on. The trail climbed steeply, and before long we found ourselves at a clearing that overlooked the valley below. The view was stunning. The trees stretched out for miles, the valley bathed in golden afternoon light, but something felt off. The silence was too heavy, too complete, and in the distance, far beyond the valley, I thought I saw movement, something shifting in the shadows of the trees. Jenna didn't notice. She was too busy taking photos, her camera clicking away as she captured the scenery. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, but I didn't say anything. Not yet. We decided to keep moving, heading further up the ridge toward what the map said would be the peak. The trail grew narrower, the trees closer together. The sunlight that had warmed the valley was gone now, swallowed by the thick canopy overhead. As we climbed higher, the forest seemed to change. The trees were taller here, older, their trunks twisted and blackened like they'd been scorched long ago. And then there were the markings. At first, it was just one or two trees with deep gouges in their bark, like something sharp had been dragged across them. But the further we went, the more we saw. Dozens of trees, all marked with the same jagged slashes. They weren't random either. They formed strange patterns, almost like symbols, old, primitive symbols. Jenna crouched beside one of the trees, running her fingers over the marks. "These look recent," she muttered. "Too clean to be from an animal." "Maybe it's some kind of trail marker," I offered, though I didn't believe it. The marks were too violent, too deliberate. We pressed on, but the deeper we went, the more uneasy I became. The air felt thick, like it was pressing down on us, and the light through the trees had taken on a strange, grayish tint. We hadn't seen any other hikers, not even old footprints in the mud. It was like the trail had been abandoned long ago. Then we heard the noise. At first it was faint, a distant creaking like the sound of wood bending under pressure. Jenna stopped, looking around. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah," I said, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate groan, like something heavy shifting deep in the forest. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded like the trees themselves were moving, bending, watching us. "We should head back," I suggested, though my voice shook a little. "We're not far enough in to keep going." But Jenna was stubborn. "We're close to the peak. Let's just see what's up there, then we'll turn around." I didn't argue, but as we pushed on, the sound followed us. It wasn't constant, but it was there, creaking, groaning, the forest shifting around us, and with it the feeling that we weren't alone. That's when we found the cabin. It wasn't on any of the maps, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The roof sagged in the middle, and the wooden planks were blackened with rot and moss. The windows were dark, the glass long shattered. A thin trail of smoke rose from what looked like a fire pit just outside the cabin, though there were no signs of life. "Who the hell would live up here?" Jenna muttered, walking closer. She didn't wait for an answer. She just headed for the door, her curiosity overpowering any sense of caution. "Jenna, don't," I called after her. But she was already at the door, pushing it open with a creak that sent chills down my spine. Inside, the cabin was worse than I expected. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The floor was covered in debris, and the walls were lined with old crumbling furniture. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room, on the floor, was a circle of stones. Dark, slick stones arranged in a deliberate pattern, with symbols etched into them, the same symbols we'd seen on the trees. And in the middle of the circle, half buried in the dirt, were bones, human bones. Jenna froze, her face pale. "What the hell is this?" she whispered, stepping back. "We need to go," I said, grabbing her arm. "Now." She didn't argue. We bolted out of the cabin, back onto the trail, but something was wrong. The path we'd taken wasn't there anymore. The trail markers were gone, the trees too close, the light too dim. The air was heavy with that same creaking sound, but now it was louder, closer, like the forest itself was closing in on us. "We're going in circles," Jenna muttered, panic rising in her voice. She was right. No matter which way we turned, we ended up back at the cabin. The symbols on the stones seemed to glow faintly in the fading light, and the air felt suffocating, thick with an unseen presence. Then, from somewhere deep in the woods, we heard it, a voice. It was soft at first, barely audible over the creaking of the trees, but it grew louder, clearer, a low, rasping whisper that sent chills down my spine. "Leave," it said. "Leave this place." We didn't need to be told twice. We ran, faster than I've ever run in my life, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where the trail went. The voice followed us, growing louder, more insistent, until finally, we burst through the trees and stumbled onto the road where our car was parked. The trailhead sign was gone. The path we had taken up the ridge was overgrown, like no one had been there in years. We didn't speak as we threw our gear into the car and sped away, the weight of what we'd seen sinking in. I don't know what was out there on Crow's Nest Ridge, but something was watching us, something that didn't want us to be there, and whatever it was, it made sure we wouldn't come back. I always wanted to be the cool house on Halloween. You know the one, full-sized candy bars, the kind of place that every kid talks about on the playground. But this year was different. This year, I wasn't feeling the holiday spirit. I had just moved into a new apartment after a rough breakup, and my place wasn't exactly in the most festive part of town. The complex was at the end of a long, poorly lit street, with only a few neighbors, most of whom seemed like they didn't even care about Halloween. I didn't expect many trick-or-treaters, but I figured I should have something in case a few kids wandered by. I grabbed a cheap candy bowl from the dollar store and filled it with whatever was on sale. Little chocolate bars, nothing fancy. I decided I'd put the bowl out on the front stoop with a take one sign and just leave it at that. No need to answer the door every 5 minutes. Besides, I had a horror movie marathon planned for the night. By 8 p.m., the streets were dead quiet. Not a single knock, no laughter or footsteps outside. Honestly, it was kind of depressing. I flipped through my streaming options, trying to decide between The Shining or Scream, when I heard it. Knock, knock. I frowned. Not at the front door, at the back. I paused the movie and got up, my heart rate picking up a little. The back door led to an alley, barely wide enough to squeeze between the buildings. No one ever went back there, and the thought of someone knocking from that side of the apartment made my skin crawl. I grabbed my phone and went to the door, listening carefully. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the wind and the faint hum of the city in the distance. I opened the door just a crack and peered out. Nobody was there. I stood there for a moment, waiting, but the alley was empty. Maybe it was the wind knocking something over, I told myself, trying to shake off the weird feeling creeping up my spine. I closed the door, locked it, and went back to my movie. Knock, knock, knock. This time it came from the front door. I sighed in relief. Trick-or-treaters, finally. I went to the door, ready to tell them to take as much candy as they wanted, but when I opened it, the porch was empty. The candy bowl, though, it was overturned, scattered across the stoop like someone had tossed it. The little sign I'd made was crumpled up next to it, but there was no one in sight. No kids, no parents, no one. I stepped out, looking around. The street was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamp a few houses down. A couple of leaves skittered across the sidewalk, blown by the wind, but other than that, it was dead quiet. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer, just the wind. I bent down to pick up the candy bowl, muttering under my breath about dumb pranks and teenagers with nothing better to do. As I set it back on the stoop, I noticed something odd. Among the scattered candy wrappers was something that didn't belong. A piece of paper, folded neatly in half. I picked it up and unfolded it, squinting in the dim light to make out the words. It was written in neat, blocky letters, "We want more." My stomach dropped. It wasn't the note itself that bothered me. Kids love pulling pranks on Halloween. It was the way the words seemed so demanding. Not funny or playful, but insistent. Like whoever wrote it wasn't just messing around. I crumpled the note and tossed it inside. "Very funny," I muttered, setting the candy bowl back out. "Take as much as you want, just don't knock." I went back inside, determined to get through at least one movie without interruption. But no more than 10 minutes later, the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. This time it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the window behind me. Slowly I turned, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the window was dark. There was nothing outside except the shadowy outline of the tree near my porch. Still, the knock had been clear, deliberate. My phone buzzed in my hand. I nearly dropped it in surprise. When I glanced down, there was a new message from an unknown number. More. My blood ran cold. How did they get my number? I felt the walls of the apartment closing in on me, the shadows growing longer. I tried to breathe, telling myself it was just some kid messing with me, but something about this felt off, too real, too threatening. I texted back, "Who is this?" Almost immediately the reply came, "You know what we want." My hands were shaking now, and I looked around the apartment, trying to think. I decided to call the cops. I wasn't going to let this escalate. Whoever was messing with me was going too far. As I dialed, there was another knock, louder this time. It was coming from the front door again, but this time it wasn't playful. It was angry. Bang, bang, bang. I backed away, my breath coming fast, waiting for the dispatcher to pick up. I felt my hand slip as I dropped the phone in panic. The door rattled in its frame like someone or something was trying to get in. Then, suddenly, it stopped. Silence. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just staring at the door, my heart pounding in my ears. And then the voice came. "We want more." It was a whisper, but clear, close, too close. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I bolted for the window, planning to get out, but when I looked outside, the street wasn't empty anymore. They were there, dozens of them, kids, or at least they looked like kids. Small figures, all standing in a circle around my house, their faces hidden by shadow, but I could see their eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, each one holding a trick-or-treat bag, limp at their sides, empty. "We want more," they said in unison, louder this time. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled back, the figures outside multiplying, closing in on the house. The knock started up again, all around me now. Every door, every window, knock, knock, knock. I don't know how I made it through the night, but I stayed locked inside until the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds. The knocking had stopped sometime around 3 a.m., but I didn't dare look outside again until daylight. When I finally did, they were gone. The street was empty, the porch untouched. The candy bowl was still sitting where I'd left it, except for one thing. Another note sitting neatly on top of the candy. "We'll be back." Everyone in town knew the house on Ash Grove. You could see it from anywhere in the neighborhood. A tall, ancient Victorian home with peeling paint and a sagging roof, looming over the street like a forgotten relic. It had been empty for years, at least as far back as I could remember. No one really knew who owned it, but every Halloween, kids would dare each other to get close, toss eggs at the windows, or snap a photo near the crumbling fence. I wasn't interested in stupid dares. I was 16 now, too old for trick-or-treating, but still young enough to feel like I had something to prove. My friends, Ben, Kim, and Matt, thought it would be funny if we actually went inside the old house this year. You know, step up from the usual dares, go in at night, and spend an hour in there. "I bet no one's even tried it in years," Ben said as we stood in front of the gate, the wind whipping dry leaves around our feet. "The place is probably falling apart inside." Kim laughed nervously. "I don't know, guys. What if it's dangerous? Like, structurally, I mean." "Come on, Kim," Matt teased. "You're not scared, are you?" I could tell she was, and honestly, so was I. But Ben wasn't backing down, and neither was Matt. I wasn't about to be the one to chicken out. "Let's just get this over with," I muttered, pushing open the rusted gate. It groaned loudly, echoing down the empty street, and the four of us walked toward the house. Up close, it was worse than I thought. The porch sagged, the windows were cracked, and the front door was swollen from years of weather, barely hanging on its hinges. There were no lights, no signs of life at all, but something about the house felt occupied. It was like the walls themselves were watching us approach. Ben, of course, was the first to yank the front door open. It creaked, revealing a dark hallway stretching into the shadows. A musty smell wafted out, the kind of scent that clung to old, forgotten things. "All right," Ben said, stepping inside. "Let's do this." I followed, with Matt and Kim close behind. As soon as we stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop. The hallway was lined with faded wallpaper, curling at the edges, and the floorboards creaked under every step. At the far end of the hall, there was a staircase, its banister rotting and splintered. "We'll stay for an hour," Ben said, pulling out his phone to check the time. "Then we'll leave." An hour sounded like an eternity in here. We wandered around the first floor for a bit. The place was mostly empty, save for a few broken chairs and a dusty, sagging couch in what had probably once been a sitting room. Every room felt darker than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching us. "All right," Matt said after a while, laughing nervously. "We've seen enough, right?" "No way," Ben grinned. "We haven't even gone upstairs yet." Kim shook her head. "I don't like this, guys. It feels wrong." I had to admit, she was right. There was something off about the house. The quiet was too heavy, too suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move when we weren't looking. "Fine," Ben said, rolling his eyes. "I'll go up alone. If you're too scared, I'll go with you," I interrupted, not wanting to look like a coward. The two of us headed for the staircase while Matt and Kim stayed in the hallway. The stairs creaked ominously as we ascended, and every step made my heart pound harder. I wasn't even sure why we were doing this anymore. Something about the house was wrong. It didn't feel abandoned. It felt like we were trespassing in a place we weren't meant to be. At the top of the stairs, there were 3 doors, all closed. Ben reached for the first one, pushing it open with a loud creak. Inside was a bedroom. The bed was still made, but the sheets were dusty and moth-eaten. There was an old dresser against the wall, and a mirror hung on the far side of the room. The dust on the floor looked undisturbed, like no one had been in here for years. Ben walked in, shining his phone's flashlight around. "See? Nothing scary up here." But then I saw something in the mirror. It was just a glimpse, barely a flicker of movement, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. A shadow, not Ben's, moved across the reflection. I spun around, shining my light on the far wall. Nothing. "Ben," I whispered. "Did you see that?" He turned, his face confused. "See what?" Before I could explain, the sound of footsteps echoed from down the hall, slow, deliberate, coming from one of the other rooms. We both froze. Matt, Kim? Ben called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. The footsteps continued, slow and steady, like someone deliberately dragging their feet down the hallway. We stood frozen, listening to the sound grow closer, our hearts pounding in the silence. I turned toward the door, gripping my flashlight tighter. We should get out of here, Ben. Now. Ben hesitated for a moment, the confidence in his eyes faltering. But just as he opened his mouth to respond, the footsteps stopped. Dead silence. We stood there, waiting, but nothing moved. No more footsteps, no voices, just the oppressive, suffocating quiet. Ben exhaled, shaking his head. Maybe it was the house settling. Old places like this make weird sounds. A loud bang echoed from the hallway, cutting him off. The sound was so violent it rattled the walls. My stomach dropped. That wasn't the house settling, I said, my voice barely audible. Ben and I exchanged glances, and for the first time that night, I saw fear in his eyes. Without another word, we both bolted out of the room, nearly tripping over each other as we rushed to the stairs. The hallway was dark, the dim light from our phones barely enough to see in front of us. As we reached the top of the stairs, we saw them, Matt and Kim standing at the bottom, looking up at us with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" Kim asked, her voice trembling. "We need to leave," I said quickly, grabbing the banister. "Now." None of us waited for an explanation. We rushed down the stairs, our footsteps pounding in unison as we headed for the front door. But just as we reached it, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. "What the hell?" Matt shouted, grabbing the handle and yanking it, but it wouldn't budge. "Open it," Ben yelled, his voice frantic. "I'm trying." Matt growled, pulling harder, but the door seemed sealed shut, as if something or someone was holding it closed from the other side. And then we heard it again, the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the top of the stairs. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw a shadowy figure at the top of the staircase. It was taller than any of us, its shape twisted and distorted in the faint light. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though I couldn't make out its face, I could feel its eyes on us. Who is that?" Kim whispered, her voice barely audible. None of us answered. The figure began descending the stairs, its movements slow but intentional, like it had all the time in the world to reach us. Each step it took was heavier than the last, sending vibrations through the floor. "Get the back door!" I shouted, pushing past Matt and running toward the kitchen. The others followed, their footsteps frantic as we raced through the house. We burst into the kitchen, slamming into the back door. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, but the door wouldn't open. It was stuck, just like the front door. "Help me!" I yelled, and Ben grabbed the handle with me, pulling with all his strength. Behind us, the footsteps grew closer. The figure had reached the bottom of the stairs. I could hear the slow, heavy breathing now, rasping, unnatural. Kim started sobbing. "It's getting closer." Finally, the door gave way. We stumbled outside, tripping over the steps and falling onto the overgrown grass. Matt slammed the door behind us, and for a moment, we just lay there, gasping for breath in the cold night air. "Run!" Ben urged, pulling us to our feet. We sprinted across the yard, through the rusted gate, and out onto the street. We didn't stop running until we reached the car. Ben fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he unlocked the doors. We piled in, slamming the doors shut, and he floored the gas pedal. The car screeched down the road, leaving the house behind us. None of us spoke for a long time. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rapid beating of our hearts. Finally, Matt broke the silence. What the hell was that?" No one answered. We didn't want to. Whatever was in that house, whatever had been watching us, it wasn't human. It didn't belong to this world. As we drove back toward town, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the shadowy figure following us. But the road behind us was empty. The house on Ash Grove was still there, looming in the darkness, waiting for its next visitors. I'd never thought of myself as the adventurous type, but when the pandemic hit and my friends kept sharing all these crazy stories about Randonautica, I decided to give it a go. It felt like everyone was out there using this app, generating random coordinates and seeing what weird, spooky places it could lead them to. Honestly, most of the time, people would just find themselves in random fields or empty parking lots. Nothing special. But there were always stories of people discovering bizarre or disturbing things, and I was bored enough to want a little excitement. It was mid-July when I first downloaded the app. My best friend, Jamie, was with me that day. She's the type who always pushes me into things I wouldn't normally do. Jamie was all for it, claiming that she'd been wanting to try it for weeks, but hadn't had the guts to go alone. So, with the heat pressing down on us and nothing better to do, we hopped in my car and set off on our little adventure. We set the app's radius to 5 miles, picked a spooky intention, something eerie, and let the app work its magic. After a few seconds of loading, the app pinged a location, and the map showed a set of coordinates not far from us. Jamie raised her eyebrows at me, her brown eyes glinting with curiosity. "Looks like we're going to the middle of nowhere, girl," she said with a smirk. She wasn't wrong. The pin was dropped near an old industrial park that had been shut down for years. From what I remembered, the whole place was fenced off, with warnings about trespassing. It was just one of those forgotten places, left to rot on the outskirts of town. But this is what we wanted, right? A creepy experience? The drive there wasn't anything special, just the usual roads, empty fields, and rundown warehouses that no one cared about anymore. Jamie was scrolling through TikTok, laughing at other people's randonautica finds, while I kept my eyes on the GPS, feeling a bit more anxious than I wanted to admit. As we got closer, I noticed the streets thinning out, becoming less maintained, as if the town had stopped caring about this area long ago. When we finally reached the spot, the app led us to a dirt road, half overgrown with weeds, disappearing into a line of trees. "Are you sure this is it?" Jamie asked, a little uncertainty creeping into her voice. She flipped her blonde hair over her shoulder, glancing around at the overgrown area. "Yeah, this is where it says to go." I showed her the screen, feeling the same uneasy knot forming in my stomach. We sat there for a moment, staring at the road ahead, feeling that weird sense of hesitation before doing something that you know could go wrong. But we had come this far, so we drove in. The dirt road led us deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker and darker as we went. It was strange how quickly the atmosphere shifted. One minute we were under the sun, and the next it felt like we'd entered a completely different world. The sky above us was barely visible, the branches twisting together like fingers locking in place. "Creepy enough for you?" Jamie joked, though I could hear the nervous edge in her voice. We parked the car when the road became too narrow to continue. I turned the engine off, and in the sudden quiet, everything felt wrong. The woods were too still, too quiet. No birds, no wind rustling the leaves, just silence. "All right," Jamie said, opening the door. "Let's see what's out here." We followed the app's directions, walking down a narrow path that seemed to wind deeper into the trees. The pin was marked a little over half a mile ahead, but the more we walked, the less sure I felt. The woods were too dense, the path too overgrown, like no one had been here in years. Yet the app was guiding us along, almost as if it wanted us to keep going. It wasn't long before we came across something strange. In the middle of the path, there was an old shoe, just one. It was small, like a kid's, and looked like it had been there for a while, its laces frayed and its color faded from exposure. Jamie bent down to pick it up, but I stopped her. I don't know why. I just didn't want her to touch it. "Let's just keep moving," I said, my voice quieter than I meant it to be. As we continued, we started noticing more things, odd little details that didn't fit. A rusted metal can lying next to a tree, what looked like a torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch, a half-buried stuffed animal. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just that these things were out of place, it was the feeling that we weren't supposed to be there, that someone or something was watching us. When we reached the coordinates, we found ourselves standing in front of what looked like the remains of an old shack, half collapsed and covered in vines. The air felt thick, like it was hard to breathe, and there was this smell, faint but unmistakable, like something rotting. Jamie nudged me. "Do you see that?" I squinted through the dim light and saw what she was pointing at. Just behind the shack, there was a large hole in the ground. It wasn't natural, too perfectly round like someone had dug it out. And next to it, there was a mound of dirt like a fresh grave. "Okay, we should go," I said quickly, already turning back. But Jamie, being Jamie, wasn't ready to leave just yet. She stepped closer to the hole, peering down into the darkness. "Wait," she whispered, her voice shaky. "There's something down there." Against my better judgment, I took a step closer, my heart racing. At first, I couldn't see anything, just shadows. But then as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. At the bottom of the hole, half buried in the dirt, was a small wooden box. "Let's leave it," I said, backing up. But Jamie was already reaching for a stick, trying to fish the box out. She hooked it with the stick and dragged it up, dirt crumbling away as it came loose. The box was old, worn, and covered in strange symbols that I didn't recognize. It looked handmade, rough around the edges, as if whoever made it didn't want it to be found. Jamie knelt down and with shaking hands opened the lid. Inside there were pictures, old black and white photos, of people, families, children, all posed like in those old-timey portraits you'd see in antique stores. But there was something wrong with them. Their eyes were scratched out, every single one, and beneath the photos there was something else, a small, folded piece of paper. Jamie unfolded it, and her face went pale. "What is it?" I asked, stepping closer. She handed me the paper, her hands trembling. It was a note, written in neat, precise handwriting. The words were simple, but they sent a chill down my spine. "You're not supposed to be here." We dropped the box and ran. the woods blurring around us as we sprinted back to the car. I don't think either of us stopped to breathe until we were locked inside, the doors slammed shut and the engine roaring to life. We drove out of there as fast as we could, not saying a word until we were back on the main road, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. Neither of us ever mentioned what we found to anyone. We deleted the app and never went back to that part of town. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm trying to sleep, I'll remember the look on Jamie's face when she read that note, and I'll wonder even now who or what left it there for us to find.